The greatest empire on earth feared no army, yet it feared its own bloodline. Behind the golden walls of Persepolis, a ritual unfolded that no royal inscription dared record. King Xerxes, ruler of millions, chose control over compassion, and what he did to his daughters was not execution, it was erasure. This is not the story of war. This is the story of silence. And silence, in ancient Persia, was more terrifying than death. A palace that whispered. The night the torches burned longer than usual. The servants understood something forbidden was about to unfold. Behind bronze doors sealed with royal wax, King Xerxes made a decision that would echo louder than any execution. It was not death he chose, but something history struggled to name. The empire of Xerxes I stretched from the Indus Valley to the shores of Greece, a kingdom built on obedience, tribute, and divine authority. In the marble halls of Persepolis, carved reliefs showed nations bowing before him, their hands raised in submission. The king was not merely a ruler. He was the shadow of Ahura Mazda on earth, chosen to maintain order against chaos. And yet, even in empires that worship order, fear seeps through the cracks of stone. Persian law was precise, almost sacred in its structure. Royal daughters were more than children. They were symbols of legitimacy, vessels of alliance, extensions of dynastic power. Marriages were calculated like military campaigns. Bloodlines were guarded more fiercely than orders. A daughter's smile could seal a treaty. Her silence could preserve a throne. But what if silence became permanent, not through death, but through decree? Greek historians such as Herodotus wrote of the cruelty within Persian courts, often exaggerating for dramatic effect. Yet among fragmented cuneiform tablets discovered in the ruins of Persepolis, there are subtle references to restricted royal women princesses whose names appear in administrative records, only to vanish abruptly from history, not recorded as deceased, not recorded as married abroad, simply reassigned, hidden, removed from public life. Inside the palace, whispers traveled faster than messengers. Servants spoke of a private chamber rarely opened, a place where royal women lived under constant supervision, forbidden from public ceremonies. Not prisoners in chains, but prisoners of status. Their movements were regulated, their words monitored, their futures sealed without consultation. It was called preservation of purity, preservation of blood, preservation of divine order. Fear governed the court more effectively than soldiers. The daughters of Xerxes were raised to understand their value, but also their fragility within the political machine. Royal blood was precious, and precious things were locked away. A single rumor of impropriety could stain the dynasty. A single unauthorized attachment could weaken alliances. In a world where kings feared rebellion from generals and betrayal from nobles, insecurity often turned inward toward one's own household. Some scholars suggest that Xerxes, after witnessing revolts and assassination attempts early in his reign, grew increasingly distrustful. Control became obsession. Obsession became policy. To secure the throne for future generations, he tightened restrictions around the royal women. Public appearances diminished. Ceremonial roles were revoked. Suitors were dismissed without explanation. The daughters who once walked beneath golden canopies during festivals were suddenly absent from the empire's grand narratives. What makes this decision haunting is not the brutality of violence, but the cold calculation behind it. Death ends suffering swiftly. Erasure stretches it across years. To be alive, yet removed from identity, from choice, from visibility, this was a different kind of sentence. A living silence imposed not by enemy armies, but by a father crowned as divine. Queen Amestris, powerful and politically sharp, is believed to have supported strict measures to guard royal honor. Whether out of fear, ambition, or devotion to tradition, the queen understood the stakes. The Achaemenid throne survived through discipline. Compassion was a luxury few monarchs could afford. Yet even discipline has a human cost, and palace walls remember what official inscriptions omit. As night deepened over Persepolis, the torches outside the inner chamber flickered against carved stone guardians. Inside, decisions were finalized without debate. Royal daughters would no longer be symbols displayed before the empire. They would become protected relics, untouchable, unseen, unheard. And when the bronze doors closed, it was not only freedom that disappeared behind them. It was something far more unsettling, the quiet transformation of love into control. But this was only the beginning, because what awaited those daughters beyond that sealed chamber was not merely isolation. It was a ritual the empire pretended never existed. The ritual no scroll named, beneath the ashes of Persepolis, fragments of clay whispered what royal inscriptions refused to record. There was a ceremony the empire practiced, but never officially acknowledged. And the daughters of Xerxes stood at the center of it. When Xerxes I rebuilt Persepolis after rebellion scorched its foundations, he did more than restore columns and reliefs. He restored control. The empire had tasted instability, and instability terrified kings more than foreign armies. Revolts in Babylon and Egypt had already shaken his confidence. Trust became a liability. Blood became currency. And within palace walls, fear transformed into ritual. Archaeologists working among the collapsed halls of Persepolis uncovered administrative tablets written in Elamite script routine records detailing grain rations, livestock counts, labor assignments. Ordinary entries, structured, predictable, yet among them appear brief references to royal women transferred to protected quarters, their allowances adjusted, their attendance reassigned. No mention of marriage, no mention of illness. Only relocation. A bureaucratic silence that feels deliberate. Ancient Persian culture valued purity within the royal line. Unlike many neighboring kingdoms, the Achaemenid court guarded its bloodline with exceptional strictness. Royal daughters were rarely married outside carefully calculated alliances, and even then, under intense supervision. But something changed during Xerxes' reign. The language in surviving records shifts subtly from alliance building to containment, from celebration to restriction. Greek historian Herodotus accused Xerxes' court of cruelty and excess, but Greek accounts were often shaped by political hostility. Still, when fragments from Persian sources echo similar themes of confinement, historians begin to reconsider. What if the cruelty was not exaggerated, but simply misunderstood? What if the ritual was not violent in appearance, but devastating in consequence? The ceremony historians now speculate about was not recorded as punishment. It was framed as sanctification, a rite designed to preserve divine favor upon the dynasty. Royal daughters, upon reaching maturity, would be formally withdrawn from public life in a private ritual attended by priests loyal to the crown. Their transition was described as elevation set apart from ordinary existence. Yet elevation can resemble imprisonment when choice is removed. Inside the chamber, braziers burned aromatic resins imported from distant provinces. Priests recited invocations to Ahura Mazda, invoking order against chaos. The daughters, dressed in embroidered linen and gold-threaded veils, were told they were protecting the empire itself. Fear mingled with pride. Insecurity disguised itself as honor. The language of sacrifice was replaced with the language of duty. No chains were used, no visible wounds inflicted, but the decree was absolute. Once sealed within the inner quarters, royal daughters ceased to exist in public narrative. They would not attend festivals. They would not speak in council. They would not choose husbands freely. Their lives would revolve around ritual observance, supervised devotion, and complete separation from the political world they had once been prepared to enter. Why such extreme control? Because Xerxes had learned that betrayal often begins within households. Alliances through marriage could shift loyalties. Ambitious nobles could manipulate royal brides. A daughter's affection might alter the balance of power. To eliminate uncertainty, Xerxes eliminated opportunity. Greed for stability overshadowed paternal instinct. Historians debate whether this ritual was unique to Xerxes or an intensified form of earlier traditions. What is clear is that after his reign, references to active royal daughters diminished dramatically. The empire continued. The throne endured. But the silence surrounding those women grew heavier. Perhaps the most haunting aspect is not what the ritual required, but what it erased. Identity reduced to symbolism. Voice replaced by obedience. A living body preserved, yet stripped of agency. It was control perfected through ceremony, suffering wrapped in sacred language. And as the final incense smoke curled toward the painted ceilings, one truth became impossible to ignore. The daughters were not being protected from the world. The world was being protected from them. But hidden deeper within the palace was a consequence no priest had anticipated, because one royal daughter was not prepared to disappear quietly. Daughters of the crown, prisoners of silence, royal blood was praised as sacred. But sacred things are often locked away. Behind marble walls and perfumed corridors, the daughters of a king learned that obedience was not devotion, it was survival. And survival, in Xerxes' court, demanded the death of freedom. Within the vast empire of Xerxes I, authority flowed from the throne like divine light. Satraps governed distant provinces, generals commanded armies, and priests interpreted sacred law. But inside the inner palace, beyond the reliefs of tribute-bearers and carved lions, existed a different hierarchy. One not carved in stone, but enforced through ritual silence. Royal daughters were raised in magnificence. Tutors instructed them in languages, court etiquette, and religious devotion. They were educated enough to understand diplomacy, yet restrained from practicing it. Their beauty was not vanity. It was strategy. Their presence at ceremonies symbolized continuity. Every gesture rehearsed, every word measured. Yet beneath the surface of gold-threaded garments lay a quiet insecurity planted deliberately by the system that elevated them. Fear in Xerxes' court did not scream. It whispered. After revolts fractured parts of his empire, trust became fragile. Alliances once sealed by marriage now appeared risky. What if a princess sympathized with a rival satrap? What if affection shifted loyalty? What if the bloodline itself became a pathway for betrayal? These were not imaginary threats in an empire, constantly balancing conquest and rebellion. And so the logic hardened. Remove uncertainty by removing agency. Within the protected quarters, Chambers historians cautiously identify from administrative records, life followed a rigid structure. The daughters were not tortured. They were not starved. They were preserved. Attendants monitored their movements. Conversations were limited. Religious observances filled their hours. The language surrounding their confinement framed it as elevation, a spiritual responsibility to maintain dynastic purity. But sacred duty can feel indistinguishable from captivity when choice is absent. Ancient Persian society valued order above all else. Chaos was the enemy of divine harmony. The king's role was to maintain that harmony through strength. In this worldview, personal sacrifice for imperial stability was not cruelty, it was necessity. Yet necessity often becomes the justification for moral erosion. Fragments from Persepolis tablets reveal ration distributions to royal women long after their disappearance from public inscriptions. Their existence continued materially, but their political presence vanished. No foreign marriages, no ceremonial appearances, no public acknowledgments. History did not declare them dead. It rendered them invisible. One account from later Greek writers hints at a princess who questioned her confinement, a whisper of resistance that unsettled the court. While Greek narratives often dramatize Persian excess, even exaggerated tales reflect underlying tensions. A daughter raised to embody imperial pride, suddenly confined to ritual isolation, would feel the shock of contradiction. She was taught she mattered, then taught she must disappear. Queen Amestris, powerful and feared in her own right, reportedly enforced strict discipline within the women's quarters. Whether motivated by loyalty to Xerxes, personal ambition, or genuine belief in preserving the dynasty, she understood the fragile architecture of power. In royal courts, insecurity breeds severity. To protect the throne for sons and heirs, daughters became controlled variables in a dangerous equation. Yet something unexpected occurred within those silent halls. Isolation does not always produce obedience. Sometimes it sharpens awareness. The daughters witnessed the machinery of authority from a perspective no general could see. They understood the fragility behind their father's strength. They saw how fear guided decisions disguised as divine will. And in that understanding, a dangerous seed took root. Because control sustained by fear must constantly reinforce itself. And if even one royal daughter refused to accept her assigned silence, the ritual meant to guarantee stability could ignite the very chaos it sought to prevent. Behind guarded doors, beneath painted ceilings and flickering oil lamps, a quiet defiance began to form. And when a sacred system faces resistance from within its own bloodline, history does not remain silent for long. The ceremony of living silence, the torches were lit not for celebration, but for containment. What the empire called sanctification was, in truth, a burial without a grave. And once the ritual began, no royal daughter ever returned unchanged. In the heart of Persepolis, beneath towering columns carved with lions and kings, there existed a chamber rarely mentioned in formal inscriptions. It was not a dungeon. It was not a prison. It was adorned with polished stone floors, bronze braziers, and embroidered tapestries depicting divine order triumphing over chaos. To outsiders, it would have appeared sacred. To those within, it marked the end of identity. Under the reign of Xerxes I, rituals became instruments of stability. The empire had grown vast, but vastness breeds vulnerability. Revolts had tested royal authority. Assassination threats lingered like shadows behind courtly smiles. In such an atmosphere, trust was rare, and bloodline control became paramount. The daughters of the king were no longer symbols of alliance. They were potential liabilities. The ceremony of living silence, as some modern historians cautiously refer to it, was not recorded in royal proclamations. It survives only through fragmented tablets, architectural anomalies in the palace complex, and later, accounts written by observers who barely understood what they witnessed. The ritual's purpose was framed as preservation of purity and divine favor. Its true function was far colder. When a royal daughter reached maturity, priests loyal to the throne conducted a private rite. Incense thickened the air. Sacred hymns echoed against stone. She was dressed in garments of white and gold, colors symbolizing holiness and continuity. Her hair was veiled, her jewelry removed. Before witnesses sworn to secrecy, she pledged obedience not merely to her father, but to the divine order he embodied. Then came the decree. From that night forward, her presence in public life would cease. She would not attend state festivals. She would not be displayed before foreign envoys. Suitors would not approach her without royal approval. Approval rarely granted. Her chambers would become her world. Her voice confined to walls that absorbed secrets without echo. No chains were fastened, no violence enacted. Yet the effect was absolute. She was alive, fed, guarded, honored in language, and erased in reality. Why would such a ritual exist? Because fear of internal instability outweighed the value of outward diplomacy. Xerxes had seen how royal marriages could create competing loyalties. A daughter's alliance might empower a noble family too greatly. Her affection could influence political decisions. In a court already strained by insecurity, unpredictability became intolerable. Ancient Persian ideology emphasized order above all else. Chaos was evil. The king's duty was to suppress it. If that required sacrificing the autonomy of his own blood, it could be justified as service to cosmic balance. The daughters were told their isolation strengthened the empire. They were guardians of purity, silent pillars supporting a divine throne. But within silence, a human mind does not remain still. Confined to ritual observance and restricted companionship, royal daughters began to understand the paradox of their existence. Raised to represent imperial grandeur, they were now hidden like dangerous relics. Educated to embody diplomacy, they were denied participation. The psychological weight of that contradiction pressed heavily upon them. Whispers began circulating among attendants. One princess had refused to recite the final oath without hesitation. Another questioned why divine order required the disappearance of daughters, but not sons. Such thoughts were dangerous, not because they were violent, but because they challenged belief itself. And belief was the true foundation of Xerxes' authority. If divine right could be questioned within palace walls, the entire structure trembled. The ceremony of living silence was designed to prevent chaos. Yet by suppressing identity and autonomy, it risked cultivating resentment more explosive than rebellion. As incense smoke coiled toward painted ceilings and bronze doors sealed once more, the ritual appeared complete. The empire remained intact, order preserved, silence secured. But within that silence, something had awakened, something no priest had predicted, and no king could fully control. Because when faith transforms into fear, and obedience into enforced invisibility, the next act of history is never predictable. The mother who watched, she was queen of the greatest empire on earth, yet powerless before one decision. In the chamber of incense and oath, a mother stood still while her daughters vanished into ritual silence. And in her stillness, history hid its most unsettling truth. Long before whispers of rebellion echoed through Persepolis, Amestris understood the mechanics of survival. As wife to Xerxes I, she occupied a position of immense influence, but influence in ancient courts was rarely soft. It was strategic, deliberate, and often ruthless. Power did not belong to the sentimental. It belonged to those who adapted to fear before fear consumed them. Amestris had witnessed the fragility of empire. She saw Babylon rise in defiance. She saw Egypt challenge Persian dominance. She knew that one fracture within the royal household could ripple across provinces like a crack in marble. Daughters were not merely loved, they were calculated. And calculation leaves little space for tenderness. When the ceremony of living silence was formalized under Xerxes' tightening authority, Amestris did not protest publicly. Records suggest she enforced discipline within the women's quarters, ensuring that protocol was followed without hesitation. Some historians portray her as cruel. Others argue she was pragmatic, protecting sons, heirs, and the dynasty itself. But beneath political interpretation lies a more haunting possibility, that she understood the ritual was wrong, yet believed it necessary. Inside the palace, tension thickened like the smoke of burning myrrh. Royal daughters no longer walked freely beneath carved reliefs depicting tribute from distant lands. Their laughter faded from courtyards once filled with music. Instead, guarded corridors led to chambers of isolation where devotion replaced identity. The queen observed this transformation in silence. Why did she not intervene? Because intervention would signal weakness. In a court governed by perception, weakness could invite conspiracy. Xerxes' authority depended on unwavering image. If even the queen questioned the ritual, courtiers might interpret doubt as division. And division breeds ambition. Ancient Persian ideology framed kingship as divine mandate. The ruler upheld cosmic order against chaos. To oppose him publicly was not merely political rebellion, it was spiritual defiance. Amestris, raised within this belief system, may have viewed personal sacrifice as a duty to a greater structure. But belief does not extinguish instinct. A mother knows when her child is afraid. Sources from Greek writers describe Amestris as formidable, capable of harsh decisions herself. Yet Greek narratives often sensationalized Persian women to emphasize decadence or cruelty. Archaeological evidence presents a more complex portrait, a queen deeply involved in religious dedications, estate management, and palace administration. Not passive, not ignorant, fully aware of consequences. In the dim corridors beyond the ritual chamber, it is said one daughter turned toward her mother before the final oath was sealed. No chains bound her, no visible threat loomed. Yet her eyes held something more piercing than fear, betrayal. Not because she doubted her father's power, but because she understood her mother would not stop it. That moment fractured something unseen. The empire remained stable. Satrapies obeyed. Armies marched. Inscriptions continued to proclaim divine favor upon Xerxes' reign. But within the palace, silence grew heavier. It pressed against stone walls. It lingered in the pauses between ceremonial chants. It echoed in chambers where daughters once dreamed of alliances, not confinement. Greed for permanence had overridden compassion. Insecurity about succession had silenced affection. Shock was not loud. It was gradual, a realization spreading quietly among palace attendants that something sacred had been distorted. And as years passed, the queen's authority endured, but her household transformed into a monument of absence. Royal daughters lived, yet did not live. They breathed, yet did not belong to the world beyond their guarded halls. But history does not remain obedient forever, because buried beneath administrative tablets and royal reliefs lies evidence that one of those daughters did something unthinkable, something that threatened not only the ritual, but the illusion of divine order itself. And when silence breaks inside a palace built on fear, empires do not tremble quietly. The truth history tried to bury empires fall loudly, but their darkest decisions are erased quietly. What Xerxes did was never carved into stone reliefs, because some truths are too dangerous to immortalize. When we stand today among the ruins of Persepolis, shattered columns beneath open sky, we see grandeur frozen in stone. We see tribute bearers carved in perfect symmetry. We see kings towering above subjects, symbols of divine order defeating chaos. What we do not see are the chambers of silence. What we do not read are the names of daughters removed from history without burial. Under the reign of Xerxes I, the Achaemenid Empire achieved immense architectural and administrative sophistication. Its bureaucracy was advanced, its record-keeping meticulous. Grain deliveries, labor assignments, religious dedications, all preserved in clay tablets. Yet within that precision lies absence. Royal daughters who once appeared in early references simply disappear from official narratives. Not recorded as executed, not recorded as married into foreign courts, not recorded as deceased, just gone. Historians debate whether this silence reflects ordinary seclusion customary to elite women in ancient Persia. But the pattern under Xerxes feels intensified. Greek writers, including Herodotus, described the Persian court as severe and suspicious. While Greek accounts must be read critically, they align with archaeological hints of tightened royal control during periods of instability. After revolts shook the empire, Xerxes hardened policy. Stability became obsession. Obsession became doctrine. The ritual that confined his daughters was never labeled punishment. It was framed as preservation of bloodline, of divine favor, of imperial continuity. But preservation without choice becomes erasure. To live without voice, without participation, without visibility, that is not protection. It is a slow extinguishing of identity. Why did history attempt to soften this reality? Because empires construct memory carefully. Inscriptions were propaganda tools, not confessions. Reliefs displayed triumph, not insecurity. The king chosen by Ahura Mazda could not be shown as fearful of his own household. To admit that daughters were silenced to prevent political unpredictability would expose vulnerability at the heart of absolute power. Yet vulnerability was precisely what haunted Xerxes. He had seen rebellion ignite across provinces. He had witnessed loyalty shift like desert sand. He understood that threats do not always march with armies. Sometimes they are born within the palace itself. A marriage alliance could empower rivals. A daughter's influence could alter succession dynamics. In a world ruled by dynastic continuity, unpredictability was intolerable. So he chose control over trust. The tragedy lies not in visible brutality, but in calculated containment. No blood-stained marble floors. No public executions terrified the masses. Instead, a quieter cruelty unfolded. Daughters transformed into living relics of dynastic fear. Their existence reduced to ritual obedience. Their potential dissolved in sacred language. And perhaps most unsettling of all is this: the empire endured. Xerxes' throne did not collapse because of the ritual. Administration continued. Armies marched. Successors inherited the crown. On the surface, the policy worked. Order was maintained. Chaos suppressed. But beneath preserved stability lingered an invisible cost: the erosion of humanity within absolute authority. The ruins of Persepolis, burned later by Alexander of Macedon, stand today as silent witnesses. Fire consumed inscriptions, but could not erase questions. What does it mean when a father prioritizes empire over his daughter's freedom? When sacred tradition becomes shield for insecurity? When silence is mistaken for peace? History often remembers battles and conquests. It glorifies expansion and architecture. But sometimes the most revealing truths are hidden in absence, in the names never carved, in the voices never recorded. What King Xerxes did to his daughters was not spectacular in violence. It was systematic in suppression. It challenged the belief that greatness and morality move together. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable reflection, that power, when gripped too tightly, suffocates even those it claims to protect. And perhaps that is the darkest revelation of all, because empires do not only rise and fall through war. Sometimes they erode quietly, beginning inside their own walls.